Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to try to be very short. It is quite interesting listening to the professor here, particularly around the challenges to whether should we still keep the market forces to regulate themselves, given what we've seen in the last few years, that actually the market forces have been very irresponsible dealing with our money. Are we going to keep on letting them regulate themselves, or will the visible hand keep on playing a role in regulating this? I actually want to talk to you in terms of the presentation that we have, is to give you key statistics and to share with you some attractions about the country, the challenges that we are having, and government intervention. But because of the time pressure, I think it's going to be a challenge for me to run through all those details that I have here. But it's worth really noting that the turbulence that we are seeing in North Africa and the Middle East will keep on having a very direct impact in terms of the nation branding. You'll all recall just before the World Cup that there were challenges in South Africa. Once there was this attack in Cabinda province, which is a very remote part of Angola in the north. People were raising questions about the viability of South Africa to host the World Cup. People were relating this attack in Angola in terms of South Africa. We actually needed to start explaining to most people the difference between Angola and South Africa. And now, given the turbulence that is going on in North Africa, the nation branding is going to face a similar challenge. People are going to raise questions about what is going on in North Africa and the rest of Africa. Is there an understanding that Africa, it's one village? The Americans actually are very good in mentioning this. Each time I spend time in the U.S., the Americans used to ask you, are you from South Africa? And they'll ask you about Amadou in Niger, if you know him, coming from South Africa. Because the perception is that Niger and South Africa are the same, and little do they realize that it's so huge. The difference is so huge. So the impact in terms of this kind of perception about the African continent is going to keep on affecting us. And I can say, as a student of international relations, we're going to have to do a lot in terms of explaining ourselves, not only as a country, but as a continent as we move forward. Now, Professor spoke about the impact of globalization. And as we know, starting from the Chou monarchy, the key forces of change has been around communication and other variants that you all know. Now, we are seeing communication playing a critical role in terms of the changes that are taking place in North Africa. The Facebook of Prof that he spoke about here, and Twitter and so on, have come out as the key factors driving change. So communication remains a vital and a critical instrument in terms of moving change. It even more so given the globalized nature of doing things. Now, coming back to our presentation, we as a country have a very good positive image about our brand. As you know, the South Africa brand has suffered from a lot of issues, dating back to apartheid and later on, something that we're still grappling with, to deal with the racial harmonization in the country. It's only 17 years since the advent of our democracy, and yet there are questions that keeps on lingering about the whole racial harmony that we are faced with in the country. Nation branding, it's all about strategic marketing to promote the country's image, but this goes against other forces that we have no control over as we try to profile and market the country image. We as a government have decided to embark specifically in terms of profiling our own country and dealing with issues that are related to our own economic development and political development in general to look around the issue of tourism. Tourism to us has become a key diplomatic initiatives that we needed to do, and we look at tourism within the broader realm of economic diplomacy, and we've zeroed in specifically on this issue. There is a debate generally going on even amongst economists, I would not claim to be one of them, about tourism and the economics. Is tourism part of economics or what? In our country, for instance, at the University of Pretoria, you will find tourism falls within the humanities faculties, and the other wing of tourism, it's actually in the economics faculty. That keeps on showing the challenges that are related to that. But there are critical instruments that we are trying to develop and that the world is developing in terms of measuring the direct input of tourism into the economy. We are really looking in terms of developing the sector, looking also at our culture and heritage, and tourism would have an impact in terms of changing the way of life. Can I just show you a few statistics that are coming here? I'm trying to rush through this presentation that essentially relates to the country. I mean, if you look at where we stand in terms of GDP, we are a small country. We are a small country more so given that we sometimes play in the $1 trillion league. If you look at the relationship that we have within IPSA, you realize that the Chinese are standing at about $4.something trillion. Then next is Brazil, about 1.1 trillion. Then it's China. It's India. That is also moving at about $1.3 trillion. Then you ask yourself, South Africa with a GDP of 280 billion, what is the significance? Are we the junior partner in the whole relationship? And yet, in terms of resources that we possess as a country, we have huge resources. The other day I was listening to a presentation that in terms of the mineral resources that we have in the country, that they are valued at the moment at close to $5 trillion, what we have not yet explored. But are we going to explore this overnight, or is this part of the heritage for the future? These are some of the challenges that we faced with. How are we going to balance this against the environmental requirements and so on? Now, these are essentially the statistics of what we have, but I'd like to really take you through the per capita income of the country, which really creates a challenge as we try to market what we call in the country domestic tourism. That there's an argument always that most South Africans were unable to travel. But if you look at where we are standing at $5,744, our per capita income, we're much greater than a country like China. And yet if you look at the Chinese, the manner in which they travel is totally different. So it negates the argument that South Africans, we don't have enough disposable income. The Chinese are currently doing about 1.3 trillion visits within the country. 1.3 billion visits, I'm sorry. And we are standing at 33 million visits that we are doing as South Africans. And if you look at the disposable income, we do have the capacity to do a lot of traveling. So there's a need for cultural and for cultural change within the country to realize the potential that the domestic market presents. Of course, the U.S. is doing very well in terms of the domestic trips that are undertaken. I think the U.S. stands at about 1.4 billion. But the interesting story is the whole evolution in China. That this change in terms of the domestic tourism has been driven by the infrastructure development. The Chinese government took a deliberate decision to create a very huge infrastructure to move this tourism industry. Now, if you look at the statistics here and look at what's going on in the country, there's something that does not gel at all. The country has been experienced some level of development even during the economic crisis, if you look at the statistics here. But of critical importance, you realize that in 2004, we had about 4.6 growth And later on, there was a decline. Of course, we were all affected by the global economic meltdown. Can I then take you to, I'll jump this, look at the overview in terms of the statistics. As a country, we've seen a booming tourism industry. In 2010, this year, we've actually realized about 15% of growth despite the general decline in the world tourism. And the 15% to a very large extent, not to a large extent, to a certain extent is attributed to 2010 World Cup. And 2010 World Cup, according to our analysis now, it has contributed about 4%. If you were to take 4% out of that, we're still in the double-digit growth. Then the question is, what is driving this growth? What has been driving this growth? Of course, there's a change of perception about the country that has really contributed in terms of changing the manner in which we do things in the country. The country has a great deal of things to offer. Now you just show you some of the best scenery that the tourism industry offers in the country. Can I then go to, Leonor, let's go to the next statistics and leave this. This is an issue that really I'd like to talk about in terms of how competitive we are as a country and as a brand. And I must say that in the last few years, we've seen the growth and the decline of our brand. And there was a study conducted by the WTTC that sampled a few countries in terms of being global competitive. And these countries are the US, Brazil, of course, South Africa, Nairobi, Australia, and Thailand. Now, I just want to take you some of the challenges that we are having if you look at how globally we are competitive. One of the big challenges that we are grappling with and that we need to deal with as government is around the security concerns, the level of crime in the country. It's an issue that we are dealing with. It's an issue that is very complex. I don't think this issue is embedded in the manner in which people live. It's not part of the permanent features of our society. It's a very issue that I think it's driven by a host of issues. Some people are saying it's driven by poverty. I would argue against that. I've been in countries that people are much more suffering than we are. But should your wallet drop, they will come running after you and say, sorry, sir, this wallet fell from you. They wouldn't even take a cent out of it. And yet, if you look at these people, they are so destitute. So is there a relationship between crime and poverty? Is crime driving poverty or is poverty driving crime? It's an issue that we can open up for debate, but I don't think there's any relationship. There's no direct correlation. I think what drives crime and corruption in most cases is greed. It's people who are actually better off, and the level of greed is very high. And I think even if you look at people who are involved in crime in South Africa, these are very organized syndicates that are actually well off. Now, again, it comes back to the relationship between crime and poverty. It's an issue I think you academics will keep on grappling with. But always there's a tendency to take a very short cut in explaining this. And that shortcut, of course, says because people are destitute. I really don't think that is the case. That's one thing that we are having as a country. That's a big challenge that we have, but we are dealing with it. Are we going to see successes very soon? I think that's a question that I'll leave to all of you. During the World Cup, we actually surprised ourselves as a country. We were able to come up with a better coordinated method to deal with crime because there was focus on the country. To me, then, it says, in terms of the institutional capacity to deal with this phenomena, we do have that. But the question is, why aren't we acting? Why aren't we always acting the same manner that we did during the World Cup? Recently, Giuliani visited the country, and one of the advice he was giving to all governmental institutions is that why don't you make every day a World Cup day? Because the justice system worked very well. We were able to prosecute people within a short space of time. And yet, under normal circumstances, you look at the backlog in terms of the courts. There's so many cases, and therefore it sends a message that crime pays. If you are unable to run the justice system to be able to prosecute those people. So there is a paradigm shift that is emerging within the country that because we are able to do that during 2010, we should be able to do it on a permanent basis. And the pressure it's put on all of us as civil servants to try to come up with strategies that are coherent and very sustainable in dealing with the scourge that is really affecting our country. If you look at other elements related to global competitiveness, in terms of the infrastructure, the institution of government, you realize that we're doing much better. Actually, we really surprised ourselves in terms of the road infrastructure that we are doing better than countries that are highly developed like the United States. Our road infrastructure is much better in terms of dealing with that. But is the transport infrastructure a better enabler to carry the tourists within the country? That's one thing that we're still dealing with, grappling with. You would realize that it's much cheaper for you to travel from here to South Africa, but it's much more expensive to travel between South Africa and Cape Town. The price of an air ticket between the two cities is much higher. Why? It's because there's no other alternative mode of transport. We are all dependent on the air transport. And if we were to diversify our public transport system and particularly strengthen the rail system, it would create better opportunities. Recently, during the World Cup, we developed a rail transportation between the airport and the city of Johannesburg. Has been rolled out now to include the city of Pretoria. But it has changed prices in terms of the public transportation, even private transportation between the city and the airport. And I think the more you open competition, is the more the prices will become better. But the challenge that we're having in terms of the domestic transportation, it relates to the public transportation. The car rental system, globally, we are much more competitive in terms of the systems that we have in place or what you can get in the country. So these are some of the issues that we are doing fairly well. But I think as a developing country, it would be amiss of me to say everything is honky-donkey. There are challenges that we are faced with as a state. There are real challenges that we need to deal with. And some of them, to our frustration, particularly as South Africans, we are not moving at a speed that we need to move with, to deal with some of those challenges. Part of this, it's of course, we've created a culture in the country of handouts. If you look at our social system in the country, it's not sustainable. We provide free housing, free health care, free that, but who's going to finance this? Recently, the Minister of Finance announced that we are actually borrowing about 1.4 trillion rands. And a few years ago, we were the only country in Africa that was not borrowing any money. But the question is, as we are borrowing the money, how are we going to pay for this? The easy thing, of course, is to pass this bill to the coming generation. But we need to manage that now. It's one of the things, one of the challenges that we need to deal with. But because this culture really of providing, it's so much embedded in our political system, is very difficult to change overnight. The President has spoken very openly about changing the manner in which we deal with this. And you find this can only happen in our country. You find people who would complain about service delivery. If you ask them, what is a service delivery? They tell you, I don't have a house. Now, if you don't have a house, is that service delivery? Now, you give houses to people free of charge, and people are thinking that always, but it's not sustainable. We will be passing, I'm saying, the debt to generations to come, and this is one thing that we are aware and alive with to deal with as a government. In conclusion, let me really talk about our own focus as a department, things that we think we really need to deal with to strengthen the tourism industry and the tourism sector. The biggest challenge that we are having is around good service. As we all know, the tourism sector in South Africa was one area that was not funded. During the last few years, actually, tourism was a stepson of Environmental Affairs because the two departments were intertwined and much more focus was paid on the environmental affairs. A little did we realize there's a potential to grow the economy on the tourism sector. Now we are dealing with or grappling with challenges that are related to move this sector to make it much more useful. The level of service that we are getting, it's not quite good because we did not train enough people to provide this service. Now the tourism sector, it's one sector that acts particularly based on cognitive issues, how people feel. It doesn't matter what we say to people. If people feel that they are not getting good service in the country, they won't be coming to the country. So there's a need to be very responsive to cognitive issues. Now we are trying to capacitate people, and we are working with the sector to try to train as much people as we can. We've currently developed a strategy that includes the governmental and the private sector in terms of moving this tourism sector forward. And that focuses more in terms of coordinating our resources and also managing how we train people. The resource coordination, I learned, we were in Andorra last week, that actually the streamlining of tourism is a big challenge across many countries. I was shocked to learn that also in Andorra, they have a challenge of streamlining. And Andorra has a population of about 85,000 people. Streamlining is an issue. Now, this is what we are grappling with. If you look at what we are spending at the governmental sector, we're spending about 3.3 billion rands to promote the country. Now you realize that very small municipalities and counties in the country, they have some level of initiative of marketing. If you were to go to the ITB, you'll be shocked to see the KwaZulu Tourism Board and the Durban Tourism Board, which is the same as the city and the province. And yet they're spending resources to market the country. Is there any need to operate in such a fragmented manner? Of course, in terms of our democratic dispensation, tourism is a concurrent responsibility. Every city or every municipality can do that. But because it's a concurrent responsibility, it does not mean that we cannot come up with some coordination to deal with the sector. So these are some of the challenges that we're dealing with, to have much more coherent and a much more focused area in terms of the utilization of resources, however small these resources may be. So that is the challenge that we're dealing with. I know these challenges are not going to be resolved overnight. I really have to thank you for the invitation to come here and to share with you some of our ideas. My biggest area of specialty, I always tell my team that I'm not a tourist, I'm a diplomat. And my biggest focus it's around conflict resolution. I'm currently doing a PhD research on the Somali conflict, which is something that I feel very much attached to, because I think Somalia is one of those forgotten countries. We, as the international community, have failed the Somali people and are not doing anything about it. So from our policy point of view, I thought it's something that I really need to do, to pursue a detailed research that would assist our own government on policy development in this area. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, His Excellency the Ambassador. If we could kindly give him a quick round of applause again. And we do know there was a change between him and the speaker before, so if you could take two brief questions, and Ambassador, if I could indulge your courtesies, if you could give us two brief responses to it. So if we could take two brief questions, because we are running behind schedule.
None? That's good.
Okay, there. Oh, we've got one at the back.
My name is Vadim Krasko. I am from Latvia. I'm a PhD student in Latvia, and I would like to ask you a question about free housing in South Africa. How do you think it is possible to solve this situation when you give free houses to people, and how it is possible to solve a situation with debt for these free houses? Thank you.
Oh, you want me to respond? It's a huge challenge, I must say. It's in 1994, when we came into power, we realized there were a lot of distortions within the whole distribution of resources within the country. One of the key problems was around housing. Most of South Africans were living in about 37% of the country's land, and they were living in squatter camps. The land people were living in was not arable. And we thought to reverse that, we needed to come up with some social responsibility projects that would include providing housing to people. But you can't do it on a sustainable basis because the amount of money that you spend, where are you going to get it? Because what's going on now, because of the migration system that was set up within the country, you find people who are coming from the rural areas, settling in urban areas. They go to create these shacks, and yet they have big mansions back home, and the government provides housing for them. Now what happens when they move out, they rent out these houses, even though these houses are not supposed to be rented. Now, that's where a huge challenge is, because there's no ownership. If you give people the opportunity and they provide some level of ownership, it will create a much more sustainable and care around it. Now, that's a challenge that we are realizing. And I'm saying, unfortunately, we've learned a bad lesson. We're starting to change the mindset about this. But it's going to take time, because there's a culture now of giving. When people speak about service delivery, they speak about handouts to get things free. Now, if you ask me how we're going to deal with it, I'll say, watch the space. Let's see.
I think, unfortunately, your colleagues were also giving me the eye, because I know you're expected back at the ITV. So I think we do need to bring it to a conclusion. But maybe once again we can express our gratitude to His Excellency. Thank you again so much.
Thank you, Chef.